Man, again, I'm so glad every year we pull this off. Man, it brings me so much joy. Today, I'm going to spend some time talking to you about the conversion of a man known as Negus Ezana. Negus Ezana. This man, Negus Ezana, Negus is an old word from a language called Ge'ez, which means king. So King Ezana, or Negus Ezana. He lived during the 4th century, and his conversion was the catalyst ultimately for what is now Ethiopian Christianity. So we're going to look at that today. So if you can, imagine with me, it's around 300 AD. The land around what is now today Ethiopia is not colonized. There's no European influence, but it's a thriving African empire called Aksum. It's a nation that ruled over trade routes that connected Rome and India and Arabia. The conversion of Negus Ezana sheds light on how Christianity arrived not as a foreign imposition, but as a local transformation, challenging any false narratives that faith in Christ belongs to any one people group, but it is and has always been, in fact, a global faith. So today we're going to take a look at the conversion of Negus Ezana. We're going to look at inscriptions and coins and review some histories to show how Christianity took root in this early African stronghold. So let's continue. We're going to look at a little bit of pre-Christian Aksum. Then we're going to cover the arrival of Frumentius and Euodicius, the life and conversion of Negus Ezana. We're going to see how Christianity takes root in Aksum, and then we'll wrap up. First, again, just so you kind of have a modern reference point, when we're talking about the ancient empire of Aksum, we're talking about today what would be northern Ethiopia. You know what? I'm supposed to be clicking this. All right. Thank you. All right. You know what? From now on, you guys click. You got it? Thank you. All right, I ain't doing this. It's too much multitasking. All right. What we're talking about today is northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, right at the Red Sea. We've got another more detailed map on the next slide that shows you what the ancient empire of Aksum would have looked like. It's located at the bottom of the Red Sea. Aksum was a trade hub, and so during the early 3rd century, Aksum rose to become a powerful empire, in large part because of its proximity to the Red Sea. They had their own port in Adulis, and if you see there the geography right at the bottom of the Red Sea, there's a natural choke point there that connects the Red Sea to what will become the Arabian Sea. This is the only way you would have been able to do trade with India or Arabia. And Aksum owned that. There was no way to get through that. And so they were powerful. They had influence. And because they were right there as a port, they grew as an empire, and they had all types of dealings with different nations and cultures and also many different religions. By about 270, between 270 and 290 AD, under Negus Endibis, this would have been Ezana's great-great-grandfather, I think, you start seeing coins. It's the first sub-Saharan African nation to mint their own coins. And the coins bore pagan symbols. And so you saw this. We can find this. They've got this in the you can see different scans of this online. All right, but what you see in the symbolism, in the architecture, in the different findings is that Aksum was a powerful nation, that it had all types of cultural exchanges, and that they used things like their money and their architecture to say things about who they were and what they believed. So Aksum had a lot of early access to many religions, including Judaism. So on the next slide, one of the early introductions that we see actually in the Bible of Christianity going into that region, we see it in Acts chapter 8, right? We got the famous story of the Ethiopian eunuch, and he is encountered by Philip. He's reading an Isaiah scroll, and Philip tells him how to interpret it. He comes to understanding and faith in Christ. He is baptized, and then he returns back to Ethiopia. But what's said here, what's not said here, there's a lot of things that we can deduce from taking a close look at Acts chapter 8. The first thing I want to point out is that when you think of the word Ethiopian during that day, it didn't mean the same thing as it means today. Today, when we think of Ethiopia and we use that term, it's referring to a specific nation, and we probably even can think of a specific people group associated with that. During that time, during the first century and onward, the word Ethiopian was a general term that the Greeks used for Africans south of Egypt, roughly. And so it comes from a Greek word that means burned faces. And so Ethiopia would be land of the burned faces. And so if there's any question about if Christianity ever got to black people, I don't know how much blacker you can get than having a burned face. All right? But this Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8 is not actually speaking of his nation. It's speaking of his ethnicity. It's speaking of his appearance, that this burned face man. And it says that he was traveling to Jerusalem. Now we know through various sources that this Ethiopian eunuch was actually a Cushite. All right, and so the land of Cush, if you go back, if you look at the map that I showed previously, what you see as Aksum, when you see slightly northwest, you see Meroe, that would have been Cush. And so this is where the Ethiopian eunuch was from. And it says in Acts chapter 8 that he was traveling to Jerusalem to worship. And so we can deduce from here that all the way into Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, in the land of Cush, that Judaism, the scriptures, he was reading an Isaiah scroll. I don't know if you understand how rare this would have been. It wasn't like there was a printing press. There was no Bible app. There was no YouVersion for him to read an Isaiah scroll. This would have had to have been something that came at great cost and great sacrifice. There would have to have been multiple animals that were killed to provide the skins. There would have had to have been a paid professional scribe to handwrite it carefully over a long period of time to make sure that it was perfectly transcribed. Something like a scroll would have been reserved, the access of it would have been reserved for the extremely powerful and wealthy. This Ethiopian eunuch, it also says that he was a treasurer and an official for Candace. And in ancient Ethiopian culture, Candace was not a name. I actually have a sister named Candace. But in Ethiopia, Candace was a title. It stood for, it was Kandake. And so that's transliterated into Candace. But the Kandake in ancient Ethiopian culture, these were powerful women, ruling queens that actually commanded armies and had authority. And this is who the Ethiopian eunuch directly worked for. He was in her court. And so this Ethiopian eunuch who works in the royal house, who has access to the treasury of Cush, he is traveling back and forth from Jerusalem to worship. He hears and receives the gospel. He is baptized, and he goes back to those lands with the gospel. And so we see early, so I'm pointing this out to show that early, even in the first century, we see Christianity and Judaism flowing back and forth freely deep into the African continent. And so Aksum continued to grow in their interactions with other faiths. We saw, like I said, we talked about the Ethiopian eunuch. And then we'll look at, go to the slide with the You know which one I'm talking with the basketball. There we go. There we go. All right, there we go. We got Frumentius and Aedesius, all right? Now, I couldn't find two light-skinned brothers where the images sat just right with me. So I said, man, who's two good light-skinned brothers that can represent Frumentius and Aedesius for me? And for some reason, the Splash Brothers just popped into my head, all right? So we're going to fast forward a little bit, so you can go ahead and skip to the next slide. Here's an actual iconography of Frumentius, but I needed two of them. I couldn't find one of Aedesius, all right? But we're going to fast forward to the 300s A.D. By God's sovereignty, through interesting circumstances, Aedesius and Frumentius find their way to Axum. Now, the way they found themselves there, Aedesius and Frumentius were Syrian, and they were already Christian. They had already received the gospel. And they were traveling in the Red Sea, and in the reports for why this happened vary, but there was some type of conflict. Some believe that there was a trade dispute where trade broke down, but ultimately their ship that they were on, traveling through the Red Sea, was attacked and plundered by the Axumites. And everyone on the ship was totally wiped out. They were all killed, except for Frumentius and Aedesius. They were traveling with their uncle as well. Their uncle was killed, along with everyone else on that ship, by the Axumites. Frumentius and Aedesius then become captives to the Axumites. So now they have found themselves enslaved by the Axumites. They are now in the Axum Empire. They're now captive, but it seems that they've got certain skills and knowledge that will be useful to the empire, and so they actually end up being brought in to serve in the court of the king. Aedesius, he becomes a cupbearer, and Frumentius ultimately becomes a treasurer and secretary. So they ended up, because of their skills and God's sovereignty, their lives were spared, and they end up, these Christian men who were attacked and killed, and now they are being held captive and enslaved by the Axumites, but they find themselves in the court of the king. So they're assigned in roughly 320 to 325 A.D. They are assigned to serve and mentor the prince, Ezana. Ezana's father had died, and Ezana was too young to rule. And so his mother ends up ruling in his stead until he can come of age and rule in Axum. And so his mother assigns Frumentius and Aedesius to serve and to mentor Ezana. And so now this future king is being mentored and taught by these Christian slaves. Ezana, around 325, reaches maturity, and he becomes the king. He becomes Negus Ezana. Once he becomes king, they're freed from their servitude. Aedesius decides to return home to Syria, Tyre to be specifically, and he ends up sharing his account of his time in Axum with Rufinus, a historian. Frumentius then goes on. So Aedesius returns to Syria. Frumentius instead goes to Alexandria, Egypt, to meet with Athanasius. If you were here over the last few years, I did a talk on Athanasius and the Council of Nicaea and all that stuff that went down. So this is happening around the same time period as those great debates in church history, like the Council of Nicaea, the divinity of Jesus, all that stuff. Frumentius goes to Alexandria to meet with Athanasius, and ultimately Athanasius ends up ordaining Frumentius as the first bishop of Axum and sends him back to Axum to serve Ezana. It is believed around that time is when Ezana is baptized and is converted to Christianity. I want to take a minute to just note the significance of how God works all things for good. That these men, they weren't even men. The records show that they were most likely teenagers at the time of their captivity. That what we see and is the exact opposite of what many claim to be the reality for how Christianity is spread. The common narrative, especially in black context, is that some external authority came and through force and with the sword imposed their religious beliefs on these African peoples. But what we see is the exact opposite of that. We see two Christians who were met with the sword and who were brought into captivity in ancient Axum, and that over a period of time, through their faithful living and gospel proclamation and God's sovereignty giving them access to the prince, he voluntarily, after understanding the histories of the pagan deities of his nation, lays them down, repents, and believes the gospel and is baptized. It's the exact opposite. We see the gospel making the empire bend the knee, and not the other way around. So, Frumentius and Aedesius, key figures in here. Ezana is baptized right around this time. Go to the next slide with the Ezana's conversion and impact. Now, what we see with Ezana's conversion, it wasn't a snap of the fingers and all of a sudden he's got perfect doctrine and he's writing psalms and all this stuff. What we see this is verified through Axumite architecture, through different inscriptions, through coins, is we start seeing a progression in Christian expression throughout the Axumite kingdom. Pre-conversion, what you'll see is early inscriptions referring to Ezana as the son of Marem, who's a pagan war god. And so you see him associated with the pagan deities of that land and of that day, and even referred to as his son. Most significantly, I'm reading a quote here, it says, the evidence of the pagan practices of the king is derived from the coins, inscriptions, the coin inscriptions dated to have been from this era that bear the pagan symbol of the crescent and the disc. And so you can see if you look up these coins, they've got some really good high-quality scans online. But then you get into a transitional phase. By the time you get to around 330 AD, you see Ezana being quoted in this inscription written in Ge'ez that's honoring the Lord after his victory over the Nobations, where he refers and he gives honor to the Lord of heaven. And so you see this progression, but again, this still isn't an explicit, a very clear articulation of Christian doctrine. The Lord of heaven could mean a whole lot of things to a whole lot of people. And so we have this vague monotheism being expressed in different inscriptions by the time you get to about 330 AD. But then by the time you get to 333 AD, we have a Greek inscription that explicitly proclaims his Trinitarian faith. It reads, in the faith of God, in the power of the Father and the Holy Ghost, who have saved my kingdom, I believe in your Son, Jesus Christ, who has saved me. And so what we see is that the gospel made its way. When we're thinking about Christianity and narratives like Christianity being the white man's religion, how can that be true when we're looking at stories here 1,400 years or so before the transatlantic slave trade of a king of an ancient African empire professing his faith in the triune God? We then start seeing changes in the coinage. The coins, he mints new coins that have his image on it with the cross above his head in his coins. So by 333, we have a explicit conversion to Christianity. There is a rich legacy that's left behind in Ethiopia today and throughout Aksumite history. When you look at if you go to the slide with Constantius on it. So jumping forward a little bit, 356 AD, we've got a new emperor, Constantine. His son is now ruling the Roman Empire, Constantius II. And he writes to Ezana. And so this is part of how these stories are confirmed as well. We actually have correspondence between the Roman emperor and the Aksumite emperor. And so Constantius II, he writes to Ezana, and he makes a request for Ezana to replace Frumentius with a new bishop named Theophilus. And so keep in mind the significance of this historically. Just recently, during Constantine's reign, his father's reign, around 325-ish, we had the Council of Nicaea, and the big debate was about the divinity of Jesus. It was about who is Jesus? Is Jesus a created being, or is he divine? Is he divine? Is he a part of the Godhead, or is he just a really powerful creation? This was the debate at Nicaea. And ultimately, Athanasius and his arguments won out, and this is where we have Nicene creeds, how we have our expressions of our Nicene faith. This is the historic Orthodox Christian faith. And unfortunately, after Constantine is gone and his son steps in to rule, Arianism, which is the belief that Jesus was a created being, a great created being, but a created being, Arianism creeps back in and gets the ear of Constantius to the point where Constantius is now trying to remove faithful bishops and replace those bishops with Arian bishops. And so think about this. While Rome is trying to figure out, where they're going back and forth, while the Roman Empire is wishy-washy about who Jesus is and if he's worthy of our worship, he writes to Ezana, urging him to replace Frumentius, his Orthodox bishop, with Theophilus, his Arian bishop, and he responds back, nah. So what we see all the way back then, we have an ancient African empire when Europe was in flux about who Jesus was and if he was worthy of worship. They were standing 10 toes down. We're keeping our bishop. We're keeping our Nicene orthodoxy. Jesus is God. Continuing legacy. In the 6th century, we have Negus Caleb. What happened in the 6th century, there was a Jewish king who, through force, he began waging wars against Christian communities in the Middle East and in parts of Africa. And they killed lots of people. Negus Caleb, he is considered a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church because he successfully defended Aksum from this Jewish king. And the purpose was to exterminate Christianity, to remove Christianity from the religion. And what we see is the nation of Aksum fighting to preserve the Christianity of their nation, and they won and stayed a Christian nation. Going forward, the legacy continues. All the way, let's jump to the 17th century. We have Walada Petros. In the 17th century, there was an attempt for Roman Catholicism to make its way into Ethiopia. They sent a number of Jesuit missionaries into Ethiopia with the hope of bringing Roman Catholicism there. And it almost worked. They even got the support of the king in that day. But Walada was born in a noble family. She had a powerful voice and influence among the royal households and communities in Ethiopia, and she would not stand for it and led a resistance against the European Roman Catholics coming into Ethiopia to convert them. And so she went through periods of jail time. She went through a 3-year period of exile. But no matter what, she would not be silenced. She would not stop speaking out against Roman Catholicism. And ultimately, the king was so tired of dealing with Walada, he just gave up the effort. And then Roman Catholicism ended up phasing its way out of Ethiopia. And she also is now considered a saint in the Ethiopian church. And so what we see in the Aksumite Empire and what's now modern-day Ethiopia is that Christianity was there for 1,000 years now, 1,000 years flourishing. And it was adopted because it was compelling, not because somebody came to the land and enforced it on them with the sword, but because they were able to look at the scriptures, they were able to look at the God of the Bible, to understand the Gospels, to look at that in light of the pagan deities that they'd been worshiping historically in that land, and voluntarily lay down their idols and receive the good news of the gospel. And then what we have in Ethiopia is a nation, one of the oldest Christian nations in the history of the world. We have the first African Christian king in the history of the world. We have the first Christian coins being minted in the continent of Africa. We have a rich legacy of ancient African Christianity that is all traced back to this faithfulness of Frumentius, Aedesius, their gospel proclamation in the midst of death and slavery and servitude. And by God's grace, the Spirit of God moved on the heart of Ezana, and he believed the gospel. And now we have an unbroken history of African Christianity in Aksum and now modern-day Ethiopia. And so that is the history, or a summary of the conversion of Negus Ezana. And we've got some lessons that we can learn today, particularly from Frumentius and Aedesius. No matter what circumstances you may find yourselves in, all of us at some point in time, if you haven't, just wait a while, maybe you will. You will have a time where the gospel is what's needed and all the circumstances have crashed down on you. And these men dealing with death and hurt and murder and slavery and oppression, in the midst of all that, they kept their faith. They proclaimed the good news of the gospel. They trusted the Lord for their salvation, not just their eternal salvation, but their earthly salvation. And they saw the Lord show up for them in a mighty way. And so I'm just reminded of God's faithfulness, that he truly does work all things for good. That no matter what it is we're going through, no matter what it is they were going through back then, look at the fruit that it's borne. Thousands of years later, almost thousands of years later, we're still reading the story of God's faithfulness to Frumentius, God's faithfulness to Aedesius, God's faithfulness to Aksum, and to the nation of Ethiopia. But that's it for my time. Thank you. This was the conversion of Negus Ezana.